Good evening, everybody. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to another installment of our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. We offer academic and practical training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this. So believe it or not, we are at day 190 since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And tonight, we want to spend some time discussing the impact of COVID on women and girls beyond the actual health risk. And as we hopefully enter a phase of recovery sometime soon, how can we change the status quo, especially for the most vulnerable? So that's the subject of a new report by the International Rescue Committee entitled, When Returning to Normal Doesn't Work for Half the World's Population, How to Build Back Better. And we're fortunate to be joined by a woman dedicated to breaking down gender-based barriers for women, Kristin Bart. She is the Senior Director for Gender Equality at the International Rescue Committee. So Kristin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Betsy, for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks. So before we start, I want to let everyone know that we're going to take some questions at the end. We'll save time for that. So please, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a prompt for Ask the Question. So you can put your questions there, and you can also upvote other people's questions that you may be interested in. And also in the middle of the screen, you'll see a green button that will actually open up a new window that links to the report if you'd like to read that further. And if you miss any of the discussion, you want to share it with friends, the replay will be available at the same link that you used to register. So, Kristin, thanks for being here, and thank you for this report. As I mentioned, 190 days since the WHO declared COVID a pandemic, you and other women's rights groups raised that alarm early on, really predicting many of the adverse effects of this virus, including the increase of violence against women and girls. You were calling it the shadow pandemic. So before we get to how we can come out of the crisis stronger and build back better, as you say, could you give us a sense of the toll of this pandemic that has had globally on women and girls? I know we could probably spend a full hour just on that topic, but give us a sense of what's going on beyond the obvious health risks.
Great. Thank you, Betsy, and thanks again to your team. Just to share first, for those who might not be familiar with the International Rescue Committee, we are a humanitarian organization. We operated over 40 countries around the world and over 20 cities here in the US. So we help people recover and hopefully come back to thrive after a humanitarian crisis or some type of disaster. And so here in the US, that's often supporting refugees, asylum seekers to really find their new life and resettle into the US and overseas. It's a variety of programs that we support, from providing clean water and shelter, some of the basics, really supporting empowerment programs, health and education programs as well. And for decades, we've been around for about 80 plus years. For decades, we've really focused on targeting the specific needs of women and girls. And about 5 years ago, really realized that we were missing an opportunity to do that consistently across all of our programs. So made an organizational commitment to really look at gender equality, and that has since evolved into an understanding of really equating the success of our humanitarian mission to actually becoming a feminist organization. So it's really from that frame that we wrote the report and really wanted to share with the global community, not only what we've learned in crisis, but what we have been predicting and some have seen actually come to fruition in this specific pandemic. So you asked, what actually is some of the effects on women and girls? There's really many, and you're right. We could spend the whole hour plus talking about that. We had predicted, along with many other activists, an increase in domestic violence as quarantine and lockdown measures came into effect. And there is a lot of evidence to show that, in fact, that is happening. For a number of reasons, women can't safely access services. They are locked down with potential abusers, cut off from their social safety nets. So that's a specific issue we've seen particularly impact women and girls. Also, caretaking responsibilities. Around the world, women do the majority of caretaking responsibilities in their households. And now with everybody, even, with everybody, both parents at home and school lockdowns, we're still seeing that still women are taking the lion's share of the caretaking responsibilities, potentially also transitioning into becoming a distance learning teacher, while they're trying to hold down their full-time jobs. We've also seen increased risk to women and girls. We know that the global health sector, 70% of the global health sector is actually made up by women. And so a significant increase in their exposure to the virus. Mm-hmm. We've seen along economic lines, women have lost jobs, are really heavily in sectors that have been shut down in this pandemic. And women have lost jobs at higher rates than men and boys. And then, of course, access to other essential services, both with lockdowns, but also services being restricted or funding being diverted into health services. We've seen an increase in or a reduced access to sexual and reproductive health services. And, just from my own experience over the last 6 months, I've had only telehealth, interactions with my medical doctors for myself and my family. And so if you are a woman who is pregnant and trying to manage that during this pandemic, those are some of the specific issues that women and girls are having to deal with.
Right. There was a startling statistic in one of your reports about this that mentioned that an additional 15 million extra cases of gender-based violence are expected for every 3 months the global lockdown continues. That's staggering.
It is staggering. I mean, in truth, all figures and statistics around violence against women tend to be really staggering numbers. And I think it's sometimes hard for the public to sort of get a sense of what that means. But we know that women who are experiencing violence, that has oftentimes long-lasting impacts on their ability to care for their children, on their ability to, continue in their jobs, not to mention just the harmful impacts on their general physical and mental health well-being. So these are really huge numbers. And I think statistics that we see from domestic violence and sexual assault providers here in the US and other countries really continue to increase, to indicate that as the pandemic continues and lockdowns continue, women are cut off from these services, and violence is indeed increasing.
So when we do come out of this post-vaccine economic recovery taking place, what do the experts say on how long women are going to feel the effects of this pandemic?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I think there is plenty of existing evidence just in these past 6+ months to indicate that, really hard-won gains on gender equality are really at risk of dramatic setback. If you look at sort of the cause for equal wages, right, here in the US, women still make 81 to 82 cents on the dollar to men. But if you have women significantly dropping out of the workforce, that really loses that population that's going to continue to advocate for equal wages and also demonstrate that women can do any jobs that men can do.
And we don't know how welcoming the workforce is going to be to have them back.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. Another issue, really more prevalent around some of the global context where IRC works is really thinking about the life of young girls. Yeah. So we know, millions are not going to be returning to school, particularly girls in secondary school, because they've either become pregnant during the school closure or they have been married off as their family needs to have other economic means to support other family members. And those girls who enter into early marriage or get pregnant young, their lives are really changed for, the trajectory of their lifetimes. And we know plenty of evidence on the increased number of education for girls in secondary has a direct correlation to the health and well-being of her and her future family. So I think it's hard to quantify in exact numbers, but I think it's very safe to say we are looking at very likely decades of negative impact from this pandemic.
It's also difficult to actually get some of this data that's gender-based data. As someone who works on policy and is, mired in statistics for so much of what you all do, and you need that information, isn't that a barrier itself for policymakers?
Yes,
yeah,
it is a huge barrier. I mean, under the best of circumstances, a lot of systems and structures really struggle with collecting disaggregated data that shows different identity characteristics and profiles of the group that it is looking at. And if you don't have an understanding of what is made up in the data set that you're looking at, what groups are represented, what groups are not represented, you really can't make a whole lot of sense and put that data into use. So you have national response plans, you have all types of programs being developed to try to respond to this pandemic, and yet really globally across the world, across the globe, we're missing a lot of disaggregated data to show us which groups and which populations are really at risk kind of comprehensively across the world. We've got some data that is telling us some indication, and we can get into that when we start talking about the report.
So I want to talk about some of your recommendations, but I don't know you, but I've muttered around my house a million times, I can't wait to get back to normal, right? And your report basically says, well, normal isn't good enough, right? And when it comes to gender equality, let's use the thinking that going into rebuilding, thinking about reimagining and rebuilding better. Why is this so important at this time to say, hey, we can actually make improvements here coming out on the other side?
Yeah, I think, in some senses, I can see how maybe, this doesn't exactly make sense. We're in a crisis, and don't we just want to go back to what we know? But the reality is, along all types of gender related issues, which is basically all issues have a gender dimension to them, we really see that gender equality is not a reality, not in the lives of women and girls here in the US, not in the lives of women and girls in Afghanistan and other places around the world. And so what we have learned through experience, that crisis and conflict, where you have social, political, economic systems really turned upside down, it actually is a moment and an opportunity for rethinking and doing things differently. And we certainly hope that it is a moment now to really look at gender equality issues and try to build back better. And we have a history of that in this country. When you look at women who entered the workforce during World War II, forever changed the landscape of the offices and factories and work settings here in the US. And so with what will certainly be a lot of pushing and advocacy on the parts of organizations like the IRC and others, we know it's not going to just happen automatically, but there's a real opportunity to reflect on and look at who has opportunity and privilege and benefits, and how to create a more equitable community.
So within most of the recommendations of in the report, you all talk about having an intersectional feminist approach. Can you elaborate on what that means and what that looks like?
Sure. I mean, this is really about, focusing on an understanding about the way people's social identities often overlap and create compounding discrimination and marginalization. So this is talking about how do we bring an analysis and understanding of racial inequality together with gender inequality, as well as other issues of class, sexuality, citizenship status, and really look at how those overlay. We are not just one individual identity. We are all made up of multiple intersecting issues. And so taking myself, I identify as a female, and sexism is something that I've had to confront throughout all my life. I also identify as biracial. My father is Korean. And so racism is something that I've had to manage also throughout my life. And so intersectionality, which is a term and an analysis framework coined by Kimberly Crenshaw really gives us a framework to think about how do these things compound upon each other. Women, as I demonstrated, we are not a homogenous group.
Right.
And if we only are thinking about how do we solve for gender issues without thinking about how we solve for other inequalities and power differentials, we won't really comprehensively get to a point where people are equal really across the board.
Okay, so let's dive into your recommendations. There are 5 of them in the report. And the first one is very simply have a woman at every table every time. Why is it so important that women, have an active role in this rebuilding process?
Well, when you think about, I was trying to think about other ways to talk about this. And, I would challenge us and anyone on this call to think about, when was the last time you engaged in a system or a program or a structure that worked for you that wasn't designed by people like you?
Mm-hmm.
It's really, our human nature is not to think outside of our own individual experiences. And so what we see through peace negotiations, through program development, through policy creation, is that if you don't have women at that table who've got equal voice and opportunity to share their perspectives and have equal power to make those decisions, then women's issues, issues of other disempowered, marginalized groups are really not going to be handled. In the COVID response, we can see in countries like Germany or New Zealand that do have female leadership at its head, that the confirmed death rates are 6 times lower than they are in other countries that don't have female leaders. And there's a number of issues, as we know, this pandemic is building upon the existing lives that we lived before, but also the existing structures. And it is also true that in women-led countries, they've had more consistent thinking about social well-being programs and overall, and the pandemic is happening certainly on that. But we've also seen that their responses were faster, were more honest, and really much more empathetic towards thinking about which groups are going to be impacted. So there's really plenty of evidence. This is not a recommendation that really should come into a lot of discord with others, that you need to have diverse perspectives at your decision-making table. And that certainly needs to start with having women at the table.
And we certainly aren't leading on that front at all here.
No. No.
So, I mean,
No. I think the latest statistics that I saw that the national response plan here, the national response team here in the US, right, at a federal level was less than 10% women. Right. And, we're not hugely behind other countries in that. We've certainly seen that, an analysis that looked at other countries' national response plans, the average globally was around 24% women participation. Women do not make up 24% of the population. And so we really need to think about and value representation to ensure that whatever the decision is at the table is made from a perspective and an experience of who it's trying to affect.
You pointedly say that those historically have more power must step back, right? Listen and respond. But we know that no one likes to give up power.
Yeah.
So how does that happen?
True. It is not something that often people willingly say, here you go, take my power, and I'll take a back seat. One way that we have been trying to do this as an international humanitarian organization who works with a host of local partners is to think about how do we utilize our access and our sort of global privilege to support amplifying and elevating the voices of the clients that we serve, of the local partners that we work with. And so, a sort of concrete example is, being invited to, IRC is often invited to high-level events to speak. We've really been trying to much more consistently think about how do we not occupy that seat, but actually advocate that it is one of our local partners who come and occupy that seat. So it's it is a different way to think up rather than giving up power. It's how do those that have power really use that power, like for good, in essence.
The second one of your recommendations is match rhetoric with money. This is basically your version of put your money where your mouth is, right? Because all the talk about increasing gender, the increase in gender-based violence, there are really not a lot of funds going into that kind of programming.
Correct. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic in March and April and May, I think many of us on the women's rights community were talking about how sort of inspiring and potentially great it was that there was so much attention to gender and inequality issues in the pandemic. It was unlike any other humanitarian crisis that I have worked through, where you really saw government representatives, the media, sort of the United Nations really taking up and articulating a lot about how there was a recognized need of how women and girls are going to be disproportionately affected by this crisis. But the reality is that rhetoric rarely, and in this case as well, has not translated into actually funding and priorities. And as you said, if people aren't putting their money to back up what they have verbally put out there, it's really just a bunch of empty rhetoric. We've seen on the international stage, the United Nations Secretary General call for a ceasefire on domestic violence, seeing all of the clear evidence of those rates significantly increasing. Over 100 countries signed on to this declaration. And yet, when you look at the global humanitarian response plan, that really, is the central place where the United Nations is funding all of its global COVID response programs that actively address gender-based violence are less than 1% of that plan. And I think we've seen the same, play out at national levels, really across the globe, where people, even though they are saying and might be articulating, which gives an indication that awareness is higher and we are maybe one step further, it is not until, it's a good thing for sure, but it is not until that really translates into actual prioritization, which is often demonstrated by money.
Okay, your third one is count women, and that sort of goes back to what we were just talking about a little bit earlier on sort of the data component and bringing that, the problems that we have, even ascertaining the problems with lack of data. It's got to be even worse when it comes to thinking about the future. Right.
I mean, we have seen, and it was predicted early on in the pandemic, but we have seen that really this pandemic has in effect really laid bare pre-existing inequalities on gender, but also on many other issues. There's a lot of available data now here for the US as well as in the UK that clearly shows Black and Latinx communities here in the US are 3 times higher to contract the virus than their white neighbors. Black women in the UK are 4 times higher to die than white women in the UK. And so when you see where we have some of this data, it helps us to understand, who is being affected and helps us guide policy and practice to really address some of those inequalities and issues. But in another way, it has also helped us to try to understand what is happening, sort of behind the scenes in humanitarian crisis. So, globally, there's about 37% of the caseload globally that's reported to the WHO actually has age and sex disaggregated in it. And so from that data, we can see that men and women have almost equal virus infection rates. Men are slightly higher, but it's well around the 50% range. So knowing that, and then looking at case data that was coming to us from some of the countries where we operate, Yemen, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Pakistan, and others, we were seeing that the reported case rates for men were actually 72 to 75%. And being able to look at that compared against what we can have of globally disaggregated data, we could tell that something is going on there. Our epidemiologists are telling us that, that is not consistent with the way that this virus gets transmitted. And so it helps us to think that even though despite testing limitations in these countries, there are other significant barriers that women are facing to not allow them to get access to testing. And we know those barriers are often social and cultural norms that restrict women's movement in and out of the household, access, limited access to maybe information, and often less decision making in the household. And so as a humanitarian programmer, it helps us think about, we need to start to address those barriers in addition to thinking about how do we reduce barriers for all for testing. So data is absolutely essential, and it's something that continues to be really a big need in this response.
Another thing that you say is essential is recognizing, and this is the fourth recommendation, recognize that sexual and reproductive health services are essential. As you put it, the needs of women and adolescent girls do not suddenly stop during an emergency or a pandemic.
Right, right. I mean, Betsy, we were talking earlier about a staggering statistics. I'll give another one to you. Before the pandemic, around the world, every single day, over 800 women died every single day from preventable pregnancy and childbearing related issues. And so when you think about the effects of the pandemic on women's reduced access to sexual and reproductive health, the increase in violence, as we've talked about, referencing also earlier the school closures and that risk that that's going to have on girls entering into early child marriage or possibly becoming pregnant. I mean, the need for sexual and reproductive health services, often because you don't have women at those decision-making tables, is not deemed often a necessary first kind of tier response in a humanitarian crisis. And we've certainly seen in the many of the countries where we operate, and from a lot of the donors that graciously give us funds to implement our programs, really funds being diverted to support health programming and response to the pandemic, but being diverted from absolutely essential services like sexual and reproductive health services for women and girls. And while we certainly want to support and know that, provision of PPE equipment, hand washing, like all of that is essential in any context, including in a refugee camp. But if we take these essential services away from girls, maybe they don't die from COVID, but they're going to die, unfortunately, from other reproductive health causes. So a continued really push to keep sexual and reproductive health services on the table.
And then the last recommendation, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if you do have any, please feel free to put those in. Refuse to leave women and girls behind. And this deals, of course, with the, we've touched on this, the great economic impact women are facing, as well as the education crisis that school-age girls are facing. Right,
right. We have seen from all of the data, again, we know women are often working in sectors that have been deeply impacted by this crisis, the hotel and food sectors, domestic workers, caretakers, globally around the world, 72% of domestic workers are women. And as I did in my own household, shut domestic workers out of coming into my house to provide services, that has had a huge impact on women in the workforce. On top of the reality, as I stated earlier, women already earned less, but these sectors are often less secure. So women don't have job security, they don't have access to health benefits, and all of those have really compounded in this pandemic to increase huge negative impacts on women and girls. I think, assuming that we get a vaccine and it can get into the global mainstream, even if you look at that being that happening, as I referenced earlier, girls who might get married, the United Nations Population Fund estimates that 13 million more girls are not going to return to school as a result of the pandemic. There are huge numbers to start with, but that is on top of the existing girls who may not be going back to school. In addition to looking at a household level, women who, maybe have additional caretaking responsibilities in the house and are also, as you said earlier, maybe not even going to return to the workforce. The economic impacts are really going to be huge and is a critical issue for particularly policymakers to be thinking about what are the gendered impacts of this economic crisis, to have that inform their policymaking.
So are there any positive signs out there? Are there any examples of countries that are making a concerted effort or taking kind of the initial steps that you have outlined to kind of build back better? Is there any positive signs out there?
I take sort of hope, and what keeps me going each day is really tuning into where I'm seeing women grab this opportunity and really try to push through some of the existing inequalities. Women-led movements are really, I don't want to say flourish, but I think are really seizing the moment of this opportunity to really join collective forces, get more public support for their issues, and are really pushing governments to look at these issues. And I think, the reality of the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial reckoning that has caused in the humanitarian and development sector is also something that I think is pointing a very direct, bright light on inequalities that exist within our systems. And as you said before, change has got to start with an awareness of where those gaps and problems are. And we do see that beginning to happen. Time will tell whether some of these efforts can really be won and born into actually policy and life change for women and girls.
So do you think that the U.S. is capable on leading on any of this? I mean, what can we do here in the United States to kind of support the approaches and build back better?
Yeah. I'm going to take my opportunity to take my water in response to that question, which is a bit of a tough one.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that can be done in the United States, Individuals here in the US can obviously advocate and support these issues. We can continue to call our elected officials and talk about how women's issues and the differential impact of this crisis is important to us as a constituent. We can amplify what we're seeing on social media of voices and call for change. And looking at from a government perspective, I think it's a little less bleak, I would say. Over the past 3+ years, there's really been every indication that this administration plans to and has been, in some cases, effective in really rolling back gains on gender equality. For those that might have known recently, USAID put out their gender equality policy out for public review. And what you see in that policy was something that we would have seen, back in 1985, 1990. It really is a huge step back for women's rights and equality. And so, all I can say is I hope people go vote. We do have power to change leaders and administration. And I think that really is called for to help support issues of women's rights here in the US and globally.
Okay, let me get to a couple of questions that we have. Let's see, Jessica is asking, what can be done for women and girls in countries where their government is unable or unwilling to attempt sort of these feminist responses to COVID-19?
Yeah, I think, feminism still is a bit of a dirty word in some parts of the world and even some parts here of the United States. So it is absolutely true that there are contexts where governments and other leaders are not going to be sympathetic to these issues. That's really where, civil society, women's rights movements locally in those countries are hugely important to really help collectively advocate and really demonstrate that the public has attention on these issues and is really calling for change.
Okay, let's see. Caitlin has a question about pharmaceutical companies following up on the Count Women. She says, It's critical that pharmaceutical companies developing the COVID vaccine collect gender aggregated and racially aggregated data so that the vaccine is safe and effective for women and girls of all backgrounds. How can we as private citizens hold pharmaceutical companies and research institutions accountable?
So, there's an excellent book, Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Pervez, who really looked at across a number of sort of medical fields, the vast absence of women and girls in vaccine and research trials. And it's a hugely interesting book to really try to understand and unpack what is happening. But the reality that, Betsy, if you and I were in our offices, we probably might have a scarf wrapped around our neck and extra, blankets on our laps because, even in places like the workforce, the temperature of the modern day office is set for a man who wears a three-piece suit every day.
Right.
And obviously that is not often what women are wearing. It is, patriarchy has really infused so much of the reality that we work and live in. And in the best of times pre-pandemic, as I said, women were left out of research and vaccine trials. And so, it's really important to be educated about, how to support and push pharmaceutical companies, policymakers to really understand that unless specifically a vaccine for COVID response is tried on women and of all shapes and sizes and colors and makeups, we really can't know whether that is going to be effective. So certainly an important issue to continue to keep our eye on and continue to advocate for.
Great. Let's see. You touched on this a little bit, but this is a question about what individuals can do to help build back better. And I guess maybe I would add on to that too. What can universities and other institutions do along those lines as well?
I think there's a number of things that can be done, in addition to exercising our, civil rights to speak up and call for attention to these issues. We know, right, as we talked about before, things are not going to automatically change and get better because women and girls and other marginalized groups really often aren't sitting at those decision-making tables and have the power to do that. So, continuing to vocalize and amplify that these issues are critically important to the public, we've seen has created changes in stances and policy of elected officials. In terms of universities and other educational institutions, historically, those are the settings for really progressive movements to be born and take hold. And so, whether it's holding discussions and seminars such as this, as well as continuing to educate, their student and stakeholder population on these issues, as you said, it does start with awareness and people continuing to call for that gender blind responses are really not going to cut it in anything, but in particular in response to this pandemic.
Here's a question about sort of coming to agreement and solutions in more of a bipartisan way. Isabel is asking if you have any thoughts on how we can come to a bipartisan agreement on some of the recommendations in your report, things that government can do, and how do we get government to act in sort of a bipartisan basis? And then are there international examples of coalitions in other countries that have brought kind of opposing sides to the table for the sake of women?
So, I think the first part of the question, right, is about here in the US. And I think, right, we know that Americans generally agree that women's rights are human rights, that women's rights are an important thing. If you look at the polls that show the majority of Americans support women's right to choose whether to access an abortion or not. I think it's important to help sort of ground this discussion about seeking, bipartisan support in the reality of what the majority of Americans support. There are obviously very loud voices, you know, on the fringes of both the right and the left. But really thinking about the average American actually supports women having equal rights to men and boys. You know, in terms of examples of joint coalitions, you know, it's, I think we have a number of examples, maybe more specific to the humanitarian context, where we've had a number of governments and civil society partners come together to really support continued advocacy and support around gender-based violence. And it did bring some unusual suspects to those coalitions, but a belief that, you know, women have a right to live without violence and fear of violence in their lives has been an issue that we've been able to build coalitions around. And I think there's some learning we can take from that in looking at how do we engage with the administration that we have here in the US.
Here's another question. Based on current data, which countries will experience the most negative gender-based repercussions from the pandemic?
It's a good question. You know, there's a number of indices that look at gender equality issues. I think it is pretty fair to say that many of the countries, for instance, where the IRC works, where there has been conflict or disaster, often in a cyclical nature for decades now, are going to be those countries that are continue to be are going to continue to be impacted worse, right, in this pandemic. And if you look at where people start and how this pandemic is affecting women and girls, it shows you a very clear indication that, you know, countries like Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, the countries where IRC operates, these are countries where women were not starting on equal footing in the first place, and the detrimental impacts are really only going to have them fall back farther.
Let's see, here's another question, a practical question. Nicole says, these structural changes are so incredibly important, yet can also feel overwhelming. What is one small thing you recommend everybody can start doing today?
I mean, it's a good question. I think everybody has a sphere of influence, whether it's in your house or in your community or in your job or in your institution. And we try to write these recommendations so that they could be applicable, right, for a variety of settings. If I had to say one thing, I would say have women at the decision-making table. Whether you're talking about the education plans for your community, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking right about social services programming, really across the board. If you don't have women at those tables, then you're often going to be blind to those experiences and issues, and your decisions are not going to solve for them. So that's where I'd say we all can start.
So just pegging off that a little bit, I'm just curious, and I'm sure folks are too, about what your individual background is and the work that you're doing, and how did you kind of come into the IRC, and what does your career path and your work look like on these issues?
Sure. So I am not unique in that I have worked for the IRC for many years, going on 17 years.
Wow.
And the first decade of that was really focused on our gender-based violence programs. I really had the, I think, fortune and privilege to work with so many of our colleagues on the ground and all throughout the region of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia to really look at gender-based violence issues and help to design and implement programs that were going to respond to the needs of women and girls, in particular the violence. About 5 years ago, as I said, when IRC really made this commitment to gender equality to be more mainstreaming and cross-cutting across all of our issues, but importantly, internally in how we operate and how we do our operations as an employer and an institution, I transitioned to look at these from a sort of broader gender equality lens. And I think, you know, the IRC is not unique in looking at gender equality issues. Gender mainstreaming in the humanitarian development sector has been a long slog with very little actual progress and achievement in humanitarian and development programming. But I think the IRC is unique in really being honest about a reflection internally. And so we started looking at our HR statistics and disaggregating that. We started looking at how decisions were made in the organization. We started looking at where are the women in our organization, unsurprisingly, more in more junior roles consistently across our employee workforce, and began thinking about what are the mechanisms that it's going to work to help change some of this for the IRC and potentially other organizations. So I've spent the last 5 years helping to develop women staff-led resource groups, helping to do education and awareness raising with our leadership on things like implicit bias and understanding how that impacts our everyday work. We have developed a scorecard for gender, I think, learning very early on and taking off of the point in the report about data, that if we don't have very clear metrics and ways to measure progress on something that often is quite diffuse as a concept like gender equality, it was going to be very hard for us to say in 5 or 10 years, oh, this is where we wanted to be. And so we've also put out a gender equality scorecard and action plan that has 16 metrics to really look at what's the progress we know we need to make internally on that front to really feel and be a gender equitable organization so that we can actually systematically design and implement those types of programs.
And then do you make that scorecard available to other organizations? I mean, is that something that you advocate that other organizations utilize, or who are you just scoring internally? Is that right?
We are just scoring internally. It's available on our website, rescue.org. And so, want to certainly, like many other things, not only on gender, really share our experiencing learning out into the broader community. I know there's, a number of other organizations that have similar type of scorecards. Certainly now we are looking at how to really make that scorecard much more intersectional and have metrics that are not just about women, but different types of women and other groups that we know are underrepresented or disempowered in our institution. So yes, it is available, and I think we put a lot of thinking into that. So very happy for it to be used. It's very IRC specific.
Yeah.
But I hope there's some general areas that can be applicable to other settings as well.
And then what else are you all working on? I know that this is probably absorbs so much of the thinking just because we're in the middle of this crisis right now, but what are some other things that you all are going to be looking at down the line and doing more reports on?
I think one of the things, unexpected benefits of this pandemic were a lot of our staff were stationary, and even, unfortunately, many of our programs had to pause or retract for a period of time. We did have several months where we had, a large amount of our workforce sitting at home in front of their computers. And that has really given us an opportunity to think about how do we work in better ways. Yeah. While remote working has certainly its disadvantages, it's also prompted us to think about, how we can work in other ways. And really, we've tried to challenge our own thinking. So in looking at our gender-based violence programs, for instance, we recently put out a paper that helped to articulate some of the ways that we have modified our gender-based violence programs to still be relevant and operational in a pandemic. And that has been replicated really across all of our programs. Normally our services are delivered person to person, our staff and partners directly to clients. And so we've really had to think about, how can we deliver similar services remotely? What are other ways? How do we maintain our staff and clients' safety and do socially distanced type of programming? And so there's a variety of ways that we've tried to kind of pivot to these other ways of working, while also continuing to maintain attention to the reality that there is also a gender digital divide across the world. Women and girls have less access to mobile technology than men and boys. And so we've really tried to also bring that gender lens into our thinking. It's not as easy as saying, oh, we can just call our clients and talk to everybody about everything, particularly around the issue of domestic violence in the household. If women are locked down with their abusers, they can't have a private case management conversation about the violence they're having inside their homes. So it's really challenged us working in different ways, but I think in the long run, it has helped us to think about and get out of some of our, norms and modalities of person-to-person programming. What are some of the other ways that we can actually continue to help support those affected by conflict and disaster?
I want to let folks know before we go of a couple of other upcoming programs that we have, and encourage you to join us for that. Next week, we have Katie Hill, former Congresswoman, who will be here to talk about her new book, She Will Rise is the name of that. So she'll be here next week. And then we have Stephanie Shriak and Christina Reynolds from Emily's List. They have co-written a new book called Run to Win, Lessons in Leadership for Women in the Changing World, and they will be here on September 30th. And then we are going to do a special program. It's not going to be Women on Wednesdays. It's going to be Women on Thursday, because that Wednesday, October 7th, is the vice presidential debate, which we will all be watching. So we're going to gather on Thursday that week and talk about that historic debate between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. And we're going to have Candy Crowley, who was the first woman to moderate a presidential debate, and she's moderated two of them. Karen Finney, who is a longtime strategist, and also Casey Hunt with NBC News, who covers Capitol Hill and Kamala Harris. So we will talk to them about that debate. So we hope you will join us for that. All of the sign-up information for that is on our our Crowdcast page here. So with that, Kristin, I want to thank you so much for being with us and this really informative and important report, and sharing so many of the details with us and contextualizing it and helping us understand the importance of it all. So thank you for everything that you do and for being here tonight.
Absolutely, Betsy, it's been my pleasure. Thanks again for having me. And I will definitely be tuning in to those upcoming discussions. They look incredible.
Great. Well, I hope everyone has a good night and a great rest of the week, and hopefully we will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.